Hello guys, tonight we have some weird medieval rules we still follow today. Let us begin our journey into the exceedingly mundane details of medieval regulations that have somehow persisted into our modern era. This tale will meander through centuries of bureaucratic minutiae, legal technicalities, and the extraordinarily dull administrative decisions that shaped customs we barely notice today. Chapter 1. The Measurement of Barley Corns. In the year 1324, during a particularly unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in England, a group of remarkably ordinary men gathered in a room of moderate temperature to discuss something that would prove to be monumentally boring yet surprisingly persistent. They were discussing the standardization of measurements, not in an exciting way, in the most tedious way imaginable. The inch, as we know it today, was defined by King Edward II in a manner so pedestrian that contemporary chroniclers barely bothered to record it with any enthusiasm. They decreed that 1 inch would equal 3 barley corns laid end to end. Not particularly plump barley corns, not unusually small ones, just average barley corns from the middle of the ear, medium-sized grains of barley, the kind you would overlook entirely if you saw them scattered on a table. Now you might wonder why anyone would base a system of measurement on barley grains. The answer is simultaneously simple and mind-numbingly dull. Barley was common, it was available, it was there. The medieval mind, when faced with the need to standardize anything, typically reached for whatever was most readily at hand and least interesting to contemplate at length. The process of actually measuring things with barley corns was exactly as tedious as you might imagine. A craftsman would need to locate 3 barley corns. He would need to ensure they were reasonably average, not the runts, not the unusually robust specimens that occasionally appeared. Just regular barley corns. Then he would place them end to end. He would measure whatever needed measuring, and he would record his findings in a ledger using ink that took an interminably long time to dry. This system persisted for decades, then centuries. People continued using it not because it was particularly good, but because changing it seemed like even more work than maintaining the status quo. This is, in fact, a recurring theme in medieval regulation. The path of least resistance was almost always the path chosen, especially when the alternative involved meetings, committees, and consensus building among individuals who communicated at the speed of horseback. The barley corn measurement affected everything from the construction of buildings to the sizing of shoes. Yes, shoes. Even today, shoe sizes in some systems are based on increments of 1/3 of an inch, which is of course 1 barley corn. When you purchase shoes, you are participating in a system invented by people who had never seen electricity, automobiles, or even a printed book in many cases. Consider the shoemaker in medieval times. His day would begin at dawn. Not because he was particularly enthusiastic about his work, but because candles were expensive and daylight was free. He would eat a breakfast of bread and perhaps some ale. Not because medieval people were particularly fond of drinking in the morning, but because water was often unsafe and ale was essentially liquid bread that had undergone fermentation. After his unremarkable breakfast, the shoemaker would commence his work. He would measure feet using barley corns. Each foot would be measured carefully. The length would be noted. The width would be considered. All in increments of barley corns. A foot might be measured as 27 barley corns long. Another might be 30 barley corns. The shoemaker would write this down on a piece of parchment, which was expensive, so he would write very small, squinting in the dim light of his workshop. The actual construction of the shoe would take days. Each stitch was done by hand. There were no machines, no assembly lines, no efficiency experts timing each movement with stopwatches. Just a man sitting on a stool pulling thread through leather, one stitch at a time for hours upon hours. The repetitive motion of shoemaking was so monotonous that shoemakers often sang songs to pass the time, not exciting songs, slow, methodical songs that matched the rhythm of their stitching. Chapter 2. The Regulation of Bread. Let us now turn our attention to bread. Not artisanal bread, not the exciting sourdough revolution of modern times. Medieval bread, regulated bread, bread that was subject to laws so numerous and detailed that they could cure insomnia in even the most restless sleeper. The Assize of Bread and Ale was established in England in 1266. It was remarkably comprehensive and astoundingly boring. The Assize regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread and beer, which were the staples of the medieval diet. Not because medieval people lacked culinary imagination, but because growing other foods reliably was difficult, and these two items provided calories efficiently. Under the Assize, the price of bread was tied to the price of grain. When grain was expensive, bread was expensive. When grain was cheap, bread was cheap. This might seem logical, even obvious, but the medieval bureaucracy took this simple concept and elaborated it into a system of such complexity that it required dedicated officials to enforce. These officials were called ale tasters and bread weighers. Yes, there were people whose entire job was to taste ale and weigh bread. Day after day, loaf after loaf, barrel after barrel. They would visit bakeries and alehouses, performing their duties with all the enthusiasm of someone filling out tax forms in triplicate. The bread weigher would arrive at a bakery at an unpredictable time. This was to prevent bakers from preparing special loaves specifically for inspection. He would select a loaf at random, not the most attractive loaf, not the least attractive, just a random loaf from somewhere in the middle of the batch. He would place it on his scale. The scale itself was a simple balance scale, requiring the placement of standardized weights on one side until equilibrium was achieved. If the loaf was underweight, the baker was fined. The fine was calculated according to a formula of such tedious complexity that explaining it in full would require several additional paragraphs of mind-numbing arithmetic. Suffice it to say that it involved ratios, proportions, and the current market price of wheat, which fluctuated based on factors like weather, harvest yields, and the general economic conditions of the realm. If the baker was found to be consistently producing underweight loaves, he could be subjected to additional penalties. These might include time in the pillory, which was a wooden device that held the offender's head and hands in place while passers-by threw things at them. However, the things thrown were usually rotten vegetables, not rocks, so it was more humiliating than dangerous. The pillory stood in the town square, and the offender would remain there for hours, which was boring for everyone involved, including the offender, the guards supervising the punishment, and the townspeople who quickly ran out of rotten vegetables and enthusiasm. This system of bread regulation has persisted in various forms into the modern era. Today, packaged bread must be labelled with its weight. Producers must ensure that the actual weight matches the labelled weight within certain tolerances. Government inspectors still spot-check food products for weight and quality. The scales are electronic now. The record keeping is computerized. But the fundamental principle that bread should weigh what it claims to weigh comes directly from medieval England and that tedious assize of 1266. Chapter 3. The Complexities of Land. Measurement medieval land. Measurement was an exercise in such profound dullness that even contemporary scribes seemed to struggle to remain awake while documenting it. Yet the units they established, the acre, the furlong, the rod, persist today, especially in countries that have resisted the metric system's siren call of logical decimal-based measurement. The acre was originally defined as the amount of land a yoke of oxen could plough in a single day. This is a charmingly rustic definition that immediately becomes problematic when you consider the variables involved. How strong were the oxen? How skilled was the ploughman? How difficult was the soil? Was it a cool day or a hot day? Had the oxen been well fed? Were they in good health? All of these factors affected how much land could actually be ploughed, yet the acre became standardized anyway. Eventually the acre was more precisely defined as an area measuring 1 furlong in length by 1 chain in width. A furlong, which means furrow long, was the distance oxen could pull a plough before needing to rest, approximately 660 feet or 220 yards. A chain was 6 to 6 feet, based on the length of a surveyor's chain, which was literally a chain made of metal links used for measuring land. The surveyor's chain itself is worth discussing in excruciating detail, as it exemplifies the medieval approach to standardization. The chain consisted of exactly 100 links. Each link was 7.92 inches long. Why 7.92 inches? Because that made the total chain length 66 feet, which was 1/10 of a furlong, which made calculations easier when surveying rectangular plots of land. The chain was heavy, it was cumbersome, it required 2 people to use effectively, one holding each end. These 2 people would walk across fields, stretching the chain taut, placing markers, recording measurements, and moving forward in a process that could take days for even moderately sized properties. The actual process of surveying medieval land was extraordinarily tedious. The surveyor would begin at a known point, usually a boundary stone or marker that had been placed by previous surveyors, possibly decades or even centuries earlier. These boundary stones were just that, stones, large, heavy, unremarkable stones that someone had decided marked a corner of someone's property. They had no particular aesthetic value. They were not carved or decorated. They were just stones sitting in fields, serving as reference points for measurements that would be written in documents that few people would ever read. From the boundary stone, the surveyor would begin measuring. His assistant would hold one end of the chain at the stone. The surveyor would walk forward, stretching the chain to its full length. He would place a marker, often just a wooden stake whittled from a branch. Then they would repeat the process, and repeat it, and repeat it. Chain length after chain length, across fields, through brambles, around trees, over streams, always measuring, always recording, always moving forward at the speed of 66 feet per measurement. At the end of each day, the surveyor would return to wherever he was lodging, perhaps an inn, perhaps the home of the landowner, and he would record the day's measurements in a ledger. By candlelight, with a quill pen that required frequent dipping into an inkwell, He would write out the distances and directions. From the boundary stone northward, 40 chains, then eastward 23 chains and 42 links, then southward. These measurements were used to calculate areas, which were expressed in acres, roods and perches. An acre contained 4 roods, a rood contained 40 perches. A perch was the same as a rod, which was 1/4 of a chain, or 16.5 feet. The complexity was purposeful. It allowed for precise expression of irregular land areas, though it required anyone reading the survey to be comfortable with arithmetic involving fractions and mixed units. Today, real estate in many English-speaking countries is still described in acres. A plot might be advertised as 2.3 acres or 15 acres with water frontage. Few of the people buying or selling this land think about oxen or furrows or surveyors stretching chains across muddy fields. Yet the measurement persists, a numerical ghost of medieval agriculture haunting modern property transactions. Chapter 4. The Curious Matter of Road Rules. Medieval roads were not engineered. They were not planned by traffic engineers or designed by civil servants with degrees in transportation systems. They simply emerged, gradually, as people and animals walked the same routes repeatedly, wearing paths into the dirt. Over time, these paths widened. They became roads, and eventually someone decided that roads needed rules. The most famous of these rules, and the one that persists most directly into modern times, is the practice of keeping to the left side of the road. This originated in medieval England and is still practiced in many countries that were once part of the British Empire. The reason for this convention was entirely practical and deeply boring. Most people are right-handed. This is a simple demographic fact that has remained constant throughout history. When travelling on horseback, a right-handed person would mount the horse from the left side. This was easier because the sword, which hung on the left hip, would not interfere with the mounting process. Are you feeling sleepy yet? Good. Let us continue. Because riders mounted from the left, it was convenient for roads to have mounting blocks, stone steps that helped people get onto their horses, on the left side. Therefore, riders naturally travelled on the left side of the road, keeping the mounting blocks accessible. Additionally, when 2 riders approached each other, being on the left side meant their right hands, their sword hands, were closest to each other. This allowed them to defend themselves if the other rider proved hostile, or to reach across and shake hands if the meeting was friendly. This convention became so established that it was eventually codified into law. Not in a dramatic proclamation, not with trumpets and ceremony, but in the dull administrative way that medieval authorities handled most matters, through local ordinances, town bylaws, and royal decrees that were copied by bored scribes and filed away in record offices where they yellowed with age. The enforcement of road rules was sporadic. There were no traffic police, no speed cameras, no point systems or license suspensions. Instead, there was social pressure and the occasional intervention of the local authorities when someone's behaviour on the road became problematic. If a merchant consistently rode recklessly through town, scattering pedestrians and frightening children, the town council might have a word with him. This word usually took place in a council chamber in a meeting that lasted hours, because medieval meetings always lasted hours. There were opening remarks, introductions of the parties involved, statements from witnesses, discussion among council members, more discussion. eventually a decision, which might be something as underwhelming as a warning or a small fine. The actual speed of medieval traffic was such that most of our modern concerns about road safety would have seemed absurd. A horse walks at about 4 miles per hour. A trot might reach 8 or 9 miles per hour. A gallop, which could not be sustained for long, might reach 25 or 30 miles per hour. But galloping through towns was rare because it exhausted the horse, and horses were expensive. So most medieval traffic moved at walking speed, or perhaps a gentle trot. Urgency existed, certainly, but it was constrained by the physical limitations of animal-powered transportation. Carts and wagons moved even more slowly. A loaded wagon pulled by oxen might cover only 10 or 15 miles in an entire day. The wagoner would walk beside the oxen, occasionally calling out to them or touching them with a stick to guide their direction. The oxen would plod forward, step after step, hour after hour, with the same patient indifference they showed to all activities. The wagon's wheels would creak. The load would shift slightly. The wagoner would adjust the load. Then more plodding, more creaking, more walking. This glacial pace of travel meant that traffic congestion, when it occurred, was a slow-motion affair. 2 wagons meeting on a narrow road would stop. The wagoners would discuss who should reverse or pull aside. This discussion might take 5 or 10 minutes, not because the problem was complex, but because conversations in medieval times unfolded without any sense of urgency. Eventually one wagoner would guide his oxen backward or into a field, allowing the other to pass. The passing process would take another 5 or 10 minutes. Then both would continue on their way, the entire interaction having consumed perhaps half an hour to accomplish what modern drivers would consider a trivial maneuver. Chapter 5. The establishment of market days. The regulation of markets and fairs in medieval times created patterns that still influence commercial activity today, particularly the designation of specific days for specific activities. Many towns around the world still have market days on traditional days of the week, a practice that stretches back centuries to medieval ordinances about when and where commerce could occur. In medieval England, markets required royal permission to operate. A town could not simply decide to have a market. The lord of the manor or the town authorities had to petition the king for a market charter. This petition was a formal document, written in Latin on expensive parchment, with elaborate legal language that took paragraphs to say what could have been said in a sentence. Please may we have a market on Thursdays became, we humbly beseech your royal majesty in your infinite wisdom and grace to grant unto us and our heirs and successors the right and privilege to hold and maintain a market for the buying and selling of goods and livestock on each Thursday of the year. The king, or more likely one of his administrators, would review the petition. This review process could take months. The document would sit in a pile with other petitions. Eventually someone would read it. They would consider whether granting a market charter to this particular town would affect other towns with existing market charters. If 2 markets were too close together, they might compete with each other, reducing the fees and tolls that made markets valuable sources of revenue. So the administrator would consult maps. He would calculate distances. He would review records of existing charters. All of this was done by hand, with quill and ink, in rooms lit by candles or dim sunlight through small windows. If the petition was approved, a charter would be issued. The charter would specify not just the day of the week, but also what could be sold. Some markets were general markets, where anything might be sold. Others were specialized: livestock markets, grain markets, wool markets, fish markets. The specialization was enforced because it made regulation easier. If all the wool was sold in one place on one day, the king's officials could position themselves at that place on that day and collect taxes on wool transactions. If wool could be sold anywhere at any time, tax collection became much more difficult. The market day itself followed a predictable pattern that varied little from week to week and year to year. Merchants and farmers would arrive early in the morning, setting up their stalls in designated areas of the market square or market hall. The setting up process was slow. Goods had to be unloaded from carts or pack animals. Stalls had to be assembled from wooden frames and fabric coverings that the merchants brought with them. Merchandise had to be arranged in displays that would, hopefully, attract customers. By mid-morning, the market would be functioning. Customers would circulate among the stalls. They would examine goods. They would ask about prices. Medieval shopping was not a quick process. There were no price tags. Every transaction involved negotiation. A customer would ask, "How much for this wool?" The merchant would name a price. The customer would express shock at such an outrageous price. The merchant would explain the exceptional quality of this particular wool. The customer would point out flaws in the wool. The merchant would acknowledge these flaws, but insist the price was fair. The customer would make a counter-offer. The merchant would reject it. This would continue back and forth, sometimes for 15 or 20 minutes, until a price was agreed upon, or the customer walked away to try their luck at another stall. Payment was another complexity. Coins existed, but many transactions were conducted through barter or credit. A farmer might trade eggs for cloth. A blacksmith might agree to repair a merchant's cart in exchange for candles. These barter arrangements required both parties to agree on the relative value of different goods and services, which meant more negotiation, more discussion, more time spent standing in the market square talking. The market would continue through the day, gradually winding down in the late afternoon. Merchants would pack up their remaining goods. They would disassemble their stalls. They would load their carts, and they would depart, heading back to wherever they came from, knowing they would repeat this entire process next week on the same day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the same market, the same day of the week, the same slow, methodical process of buying and selling. This pattern, established in medieval times through royal charters and local custom, persists today. Many European towns still have market days on traditional days. Farmers' markets in other countries, while more modern in their operation, follow the same basic concept: a specific day, a specific place for the buying and selling of goods. The connection to medieval markets is rarely acknowledged, but it is there, embedded in the weekly rhythms of commerce. Chapter 6: The tedious precision of weights and measures. The medieval obsession with standardizing weights and measures produced a system of such bewildering complexity that explaining it induces drowsiness in even the most alert listener. Yet elements of this system remain in use today, particularly in countries that have maintained traditional rather than metric units. The pound, as a unit of weight, has medieval origins. Not just 1 pound, but multiple pounds, each used for different purposes. There was the Tower pound, used for minting coins, the merchant's pound used for general commerce, the Troy pound used for precious metals, the avoirdupois pound used for most other goods. Each of these pounds contained a different number of ounces. Each ounce contained a different number of drams. Each dram, well, you can see where this is going. The Tower pound, named after the Tower of London where the Royal Mint was located, contained 12 ounces. Each ounce contained 20 pennyweights. Each pennyweight contained 32 grains. Why 32? Because someone decided it should be 32, and changing it would have required minting new weights, recalibrating scales, and retraining anyone involved in the minting of coins, which seemed like too much effort. The Troy pound, which is still used today for weighing precious metals like gold and silver, also contains 12 ounces, but they are Troy ounces, which are different from Tower ounces and different from avoirdupois ounces. A Troy ounce weighs 31.1 grams, while an avoirdupois ounce weighs 28.35 grams. When buying gold, you're using a measurement system that dates back to medieval times, specifically to the French town of Troy, which was famous for its trade fairs where merchants from across Europe gathered to buy and sell goods, including precious metals. These trade fairs at Troy's were themselves spectacularly mundane events when examined in detail. They occurred at regular intervals throughout the year. Merchants would arrive from distant cities, having travelled for days or weeks, bringing goods packed in carts or on the backs of mules. The journey was slow and uncomfortable. Roads were poor. Inns were sparse. The merchants would sleep in whatever accommodation they could find, often sharing rooms with strangers, their goods locked in wagons outside. At the fair, transactions would be conducted in the same tedious manner as at local markets, but with the added complexity of international trade. Merchants from different countries spoke different languages. They used different currencies. They followed different customs. Negotiations were conducted through interpreters or in Latin, which was the common language of educated merchants. A transaction that might take 20 minutes between two local traders could easily consume an hour or more when conducted across language barriers and involving exotic goods from distant lands. The weighing of goods at these fairs was done with elaborate precision. Large scales were set up in market halls or in the open air. An item to be weighed, say a bolt of silk, would be placed on one side of the scale. Standard weights would be placed on the other side until the scale balanced. The weights themselves were made of metal, usually brass or bronze, and were regularly checked against master weights to ensure accuracy. This checking was performed by fair officials who had been appointed specifically for this purpose. Their job was to verify weights and measures, day after day, transaction after transaction, placing weights on scales, verifying accuracy, recording results. If a merchant was found to be using false weights, weights that were slightly too light, allowing him to cheat his customers, he faced severe penalties. These might include confiscation of goods, expulsion from the fair, or even corporal punishment. The punishment was carried out publicly to serve as a warning to other merchants. The offender might be placed in the pillory or made to wear a sign describing his offence while walking through the fair. This humiliation was considered an effective deterrent, though one suspects that the main effect was to make the fair marginally less boring for spectators who could at least watch someone else's misfortune. The avoirdupois pound, which is the pound used in everyday context today, contained 16 ounces. It was primarily used for goods sold by weight: wool, butter, cheese, meat, and so on. The word avoirdupois comes from Old French and means goods of weight, which is a charmingly literal name for a system of measuring things that have weight. When a medieval merchant weighed wool using avoirdupois pounds, the process was methodical. The wool would be brought to the scale. It would be placed on the scale in batches if the total amount was large. Each batch would be weighed. The weights would be recorded. The recordings would be done in Roman numerals, because Arabic numerals, while known, were not yet in universal use for commercial transactions in early medieval times. So a weight might be recorded as 23 pounds and 8 ounces, which would then need to be added to other weights, a process that involved converting between pounds and ounces and doing arithmetic in a base system that makes addition and subtraction significantly more tedious than they need to be. Chapter 7. The Regulation of Ale and Beer. The regulation of alcoholic beverages in medieval times was extensive, detailed, and spectacularly dull in its execution. The previously mentioned assize of bread and ale regulated not just the price, but also the quality of ale, which was a dietary staple rather than merely a recreational beverage. Ale in medieval times was not the same as modern beer. It was made from malted barley, water, and sometimes herbs or spices for flavour. It did not contain hops, which were not widely used in England until the 15th century. The brewing process took several days and was usually done by women who were called alewives. These alewives would brew ale in their homes and sell it from their doorways or in alehouses. The quality of ale varied considerably. Good ale was clear, had a pleasant taste, and kept for several days without spoiling. Bad ale was cloudy, had an off-taste and would spoil quickly. The assize attempted to ensure that only good ale was sold, which required someone to taste the ale and judge its quality. This person was called an ale conner, or ale taster. The ale taster's job was exactly as straightforward as it sounds. He would visit alehouses and private homes where ale was sold. He would taste the ale. He would judge its quality. Then he would move on to the next location, day after day, alehouse after alehouse, sampling ale, spitting it out or swallowing it, making notes, and repeating the process. There is a legend that ale tasters would test ale by pouring some on a bench and then sitting in it while wearing leather breeches. If the ale was good, with the right sugar content, the tester would stick to the bench when he tried to stand up. If the ale was bad, watered down, or poorly made, he would not stick. This story is almost certainly false, but it is more interesting than the reality, which was that the ale taster simply tasted the ale and used his judgment based on experience. Taste it, judge it, note it, move on, repeat. If ale was judged to be substandard, the person who brewed it would be fined. The fine would be recorded, the money would be collected, everything would be written down in records that were stored in chests in official buildings. These records, written on parchment in brown ink that has now faded to a pale tan, still exist in some archives. Modern historians can read them and learn, for example. that on the 15th of June in 1387, Agnes the alewife of Huddleston was fined 3 pence for selling weak ale. This information is preserved for posterity, though posterity finds it difficult to care very much. The regulation extended to the vessels used for serving ale. A tankard or mug had to hold the amount it claimed to hold. There were standard measures: a pint, a quart, a gallon. These measures were defined by physical vessels kept by authorities. If someone claimed to sell a pint of ale, an inspector could bring the standard pint measure and verify that the vessel actually held a pint. If it did not, there would be a fine. More recording, more storage of documents. The penalties for repeated violations could become more serious. An alewife who was fined multiple times might be subjected to the cucking stool, which was a chair attached to a pole. The offender would be strapped into the chair and then dunked into a river or pond. This was cold, wet, and humiliating, but not physically dangerous if done properly. The ducking would last a few minutes. Then the offender would be released soaking wet to walk home through town while people pointed and laughed. This was considered an effective punishment, though one wonders if the main effect was simply to make the offender more careful about not getting caught, rather than actually improving the quality of their ale. Modern alcohol regulation, with its permits, licenses, inspections, and quality standards, descends directly from these medieval precedents. When a health inspector visits a bar or brewery today, checking that beverages are stored at proper temperatures and that serving sizes are accurate, they are performing a job that would be recognisable to a medieval ale conner. The paperwork is different. The standards are more scientifically precise. But the basic function, ensuring that people selling drinks are doing so honestly and safely, is the same. Chapter 8. Property boundaries and beating the bounds. Medieval communities had a curious practice called beating the bounds, which served to establish and remember property boundaries in an era before accurate maps or formal surveys were common. This practice, in modified forms, still influences how property boundaries are determined and disputed today. Beating the bounds was a literal physical activity. On a designated day each year, usually in the spring, the members of a parish would walk the boundary of the parish lands. They would start at a known point, perhaps the parish church, and proceed along the boundary in a clockwise direction. At key points along the boundary, at stones, trees, streams, or other landmarks, they would stop and perform rituals to mark the location. These rituals were often involved striking the landmark with sticks, hence beating. But they also included other activities designed to make the occasion memorable. Young boys might be bumped against boundary stones or even dunked in streams that formed boundaries. The mild discomfort was intentional. Pain helps memory. A boy who had been bumped against a stone was unlikely to forget where that boundary marker was located. The entire process of beating the bounds could take many hours or even a full day, depending on the size of the parish. The participants would walk, sometimes for miles, along property lines that crossed fields, woods, and streams. They would climb over fences and wade through bogs. They would pause at each marker, perform whatever ritual was customary, and then continue walking. It was not exciting. It was not entertaining. It was simply something that communities did because it needed to be done. The walking was particularly tedious. Medieval paths were not maintained trails. They were simply routes through whatever terrain existed. If the boundary crossed a muddy field, everyone walked through the mud. If it went through thorny brush, everyone pushed through the thorns. The pace was slow, constrained by the slowest walkers, which often included elderly members of the community who nonetheless felt obligated to participate in this communal activity. Between markers, there was nothing to do but walk. Conversations would occur, certainly. People would discuss their farms, their families, the weather, the quality of the latest harvest. These conversations would unfold at the leisurely pace of people who have nowhere else to be and nothing urgent to do. A discussion about whether it might rain tomorrow could easily consume 15 minutes, with each participant offering observations about clouds, wind direction, and how their joints felt, which was considered a reliable indicator of coming weather changes. At midday, the group would stop for a meal. This was usually provided by the parish or by wealthier members of the community. The meal would be simple: bread, cheese, perhaps some cold meat, and ale. Everyone would sit on the ground or on stones, eating methodically, resting their feet before resuming the walk. The meal break might last an hour. No one was in a hurry. The beating of the bounds was an all-day affair. It would be completed when it was completed, whether that was late afternoon or early evening. This practice served multiple purposes beyond simply establishing boundaries. It was a social event, bringing the community together. It was an educational activity, teaching young people about the extent of the parish lands. And it was a legal activity, establishing through community witness where boundaries were located, which could be important if disputes arose later. Today, property boundaries are established through surveying and recorded in legal documents, but disputes still arise, and when they do, evidence of long-standing use and traditional boundaries can be relevant. The concept that a boundary is where the community has always understood it to be, demonstrated through regular walking and observation, echoes the medieval practice of beating the bounds. Modern boundary disputes sometimes involve testimony about where fences have been for decades, where people have always understood property lines to be. This is the descendant of those long walks around parish boundaries. Chapter 9. The complexity of inheritance laws. Medieval inheritance law was a morass of complexity that made the transfer of property from one generation to the next a process requiring extensive documentation and often years to fully resolve. The principles established in this era continue to influence inheritance law today, particularly in common law countries. The most important principle was primogeniture, the practice of the eldest son inheriting all or most of the estate. This was not done because medieval people especially loved their eldest sons more than their other children. It was done to keep estates intact. If land was divided equally among all children, estates would become smaller with each generation, eventually fragmenting into plots too small to be economically viable. So the eldest son inherited the land. Younger sons had to find other means of support, perhaps the church, perhaps the military, perhaps apprenticing to a trade. Daughters, unless there were no sons, typically inherited little or nothing beyond a dowry provided at marriage. This system seems grossly unfair by modern standards, and it was grossly unfair by medieval standards too, but it was considered necessary to maintain the economic viability of estates. The actual process of inheritance was bureaucratic. When a landowner died, His death had to be reported to the relevant authorities. An inquiry would be held to determine what lands the deceased had held, how he had held them, and who the rightful heir was. This inquiry was called an inquisition post-mortem, which sounds dramatic but was actually a tedious administrative procedure. Officials would summon a jury of local men, typically 12, because 12 was a traditional number for juries, dating back to ancient custom. These jurors would be asked questions about the deceased and his lands. What lands did he hold? Did he hold them directly from the king or from another lord? What were they worth? Who is his eldest son? How old is his eldest son? The jurors would provide answers based on their knowledge of the deceased and local affairs. This process could take months. The jury might need to visit the lands in question to determine their extent and value. They would walk the boundaries, much like beating the bounds, but for a different purpose. They would examine buildings. They would talk to tenants. They would assess the condition of fields and the number of livestock. All of this information would be gathered slowly, methodically, and eventually recorded in a document that would be sent to the royal administration. If the heir was an adult, he could take possession of the lands after paying a relief, which was essentially a fee for inheriting. The amount of the relief was negotiable but typically substantial, perhaps a year's income from the lands. The heir would have to raise this money, often by borrowing, before he could formally take control of his inheritance. If the heir was a minor, under the age of 21, the situation became even more complicated. The lands would be placed in wardship, meaning someone else would manage them until the heir came of age. This ward master was often appointed by the king or the lord from whom the lands were held. The ward master would collect the income from the lands, supposedly to use for the maintenance and education of the heir, though in practice, wardship was often an opportunity for the ward master to enrich himself at the heir's expense. The heir, upon reaching majority, would take possession of lands that might have been mismanaged or stripped of value. He would still owe the relief. He might also discover that debts had been incurred in his name during his minority. Sorting out these financial matters could take years of tedious accounting, reviewing of records and disputes with the former wardmaster and various creditors. If there was no clear heir, if the deceased had no sons and no clear male relative, the situation became even more complex. Distant cousins might present claims. The crown might claim the lands as escheat, meaning they reverted to the king in the absence of an heir. These disputes could drag on for years, involving multiple hearings, the presentation of evidence about family relationships, and extensive searches through genealogical records. Modern inheritance law has simplified many of these processes. Wills allow people to distribute their property as they choose, rather than being bound by strict rules of primogeniture. Probate courts handled the administration of estates with more efficiency than medieval inquests. But the basic framework, that property must be formally transferred, that heirs must be identified and proven, that debts must be settled before inheritance can occur, all of this comes from medieval law and practice. Chapter 10. The monotony of manorial courts. The manorial court was the primary institution of local justice in medieval England. Every manor, a landed estate controlled by a lord, would hold court sessions at regular intervals, typically every 3 weeks. These courts dealt with the minor disputes and regulatory matters that comprised the bulk of medieval legal business. They were spectacularly dull. The court would convene in the manor house, or in a designated building in the village. The lord of the manor, or more often his steward acting on his behalf, would preside. The tenants of the manor were required to attend. Absence without good excuse would result in a fine, usually a small amount, perhaps a few pence, but enough to encourage attendance. The proceedings would begin with formalities. The rolls from the previous court session would be read aloud. This could take substantial time because the rolls were comprehensive, recording every case, every fine, every pledge and surety. The clerk would read in a monotonous voice, stumbling occasionally over his own handwriting from 3 weeks prior, while the assembled tenants shifted their weight from foot to foot and waited for something of relevance to them to be mentioned. After the reading of the rolls, new business would begin. These typically started with presentments, accusations brought by the community about violations of manor regulations. These regulations covered an astounding array of mundane matters. Someone had allowed their pig to wander into the common fields and root up crops. Someone had failed to maintain their section of the village fence. Someone had taken wood from the Lord's forest without permission. Someone had insulted someone else in a manner that disturbed the peace of the manor. Each presentment would be read out. The accused would respond. If they admitted the offence, they would be fined. If they denied it, witnesses would be called. These witnesses would provide testimony, which consisted of them standing before the court and stating what they had seen or heard. I saw John's pig in the wheat field on Tuesday morning. I heard Mary call Susan a name I would rather not repeat to this assembly. The testimony was rarely dramatic. It was factual, straightforward, and brief. After hearing testimony, the court would reach a decision. In most cases, this meant assessing a fine. The amount of the fine would be determined by the seriousness of the offence and the means of the offender. A wealthy tenant might be fined a shilling for an offence that would cost a poor tenant only 3p. The fine would be recorded. The tenant would be expected to pay, though payment might be deferred if the tenant could provide surety, someone who would guarantee payment. The court would then move on to the next case, and the next, and the next. A typical court session might involve dozens of cases. Some were resolved in minutes, others required more time, particularly if there were multiple witnesses or if the facts were disputed. The entire session could last many hours, extending from morning into afternoon, with only a brief break at midday for those who had brought food with them. The recording of the court proceedings was itself a tedious process. The clerk would sit at a table with parchment, quill, and ink. He would write in Latin using abbreviations and formulaic phrases that made his task somewhat easier, but made the resulting document nearly incomprehensible to anyone who was not also a trained clerk. Each case would be written out. The presentment, the response, the testimony, if any, and the judgment. The clerk's hand would cramp. The parchment would fill with brown ink. He would pause occasionally to sharpen his quill or replenish his ink, then resume writing. Certain types of cases appeared regularly at these courts. Disputes over debts were common. Someone had borrowed money or goods and failed to repay. The creditor would present the case. The debtor would either acknowledge the debt and promise payment or dispute the amount claimed. If payment was promised, a date would be set, and sureties would be appointed to guarantee it. If the debt was disputed, witnesses would be examined to establish the facts. Land disputes were another regular feature. Two tenants might disagree about the boundary between their plots, or someone might claim that another had encroached on their land by ploughing beyond the proper limit. These cases required the court to examine evidence about where boundaries had traditionally been. Older members of the community might be called upon to testify about what they remembered from their youth. The boundary has always run from that oak tree to the stream, someone would assert, and then others would either support or dispute this memory. Regulation of agriculture was also handled in manorial courts. The manor's fields were typically divided into strips, with each tenant farming several strips scattered throughout the fields. This open field system required cooperation. Everyone had to plant and harvest at roughly the same times. Livestock had to be kept out of the fields during the growing season. These rules were enforced by the court. Someone who harvested too early, or who let their cattle into the fields prematurely, would be presented and fined. The cumulative effect of attending these courts was a deep familiarity with the tedious details of one's neighbours' lives. You would hear about their unpaid debts, their wandering livestock, their property disputes, their petty quarrels. You would learn more than you ever wanted to know about who had failed to repair which section of fence, whose children had been caught stealing apples, and whose ale had been judged substandard by the ale taster. This knowledge served to bind the community together through shared awareness of everyone's business. But it also made village life oppressively familiar and devoid of privacy. These manorial courts continued functioning for centuries, gradually declining as royal courts expanded their jurisdiction and as the manorial system itself weakened. But the principles they embodied, local resolution of minor disputes, community involvement in justice, the keeping of detailed records, influenced the development of later court systems. Small claims courts, municipal courts, and local arbitration services are, in some sense, descendants of the manorial court, albeit with better lighting and more comfortable seating. Chapter 11. The intricate world of guild regulations. Medieval guilds were organizations of craftsmen and merchants who controlled the practice of their trades within towns and cities. These guilds established rules of such comprehensive dullness that they make modern professional licensing requirements seem positively exciting by comparison. Yet the basic concept of guilds, that practitioners of a trade should regulate themselves according to established standards, persists in modern professional organizations and licensing boards. To become a member of a guild, one had to progress through a multi-year process that began with apprenticeship. An apprentice was typically a boy between the ages of 12 and 14 who was bound to a master craftsman for a period of 7 years. 7 years! That is longer than most modern university degrees, yet the apprentice was learning a single trade. How to make shoes or barrels or horseshoes or any of the dozens of specialized crafts that sustained medieval life. The apprenticeship agreement was a legal contract, written on parchment signed by the master, the apprentice, or his father, and often witnessed by guild officials. The contract specified the terms of the apprenticeship in exhaustive detail. The master agreed to teach the apprentice the secrets of the trade, to provide food and lodging, and to treat the apprentice reasonably. The apprentice agreed to obey the master, to work diligently, to keep the master's secrets, and to not marry, gamble, or frequent taverns during the apprenticeship period. The daily life of an apprentice was one of repetitive labour. He would rise at dawn. He would perform whatever tasks the master assigned. For a shoemaker's apprentice, this might mean preparing leather, cutting pieces according to patterns, stitching seams, attaching soles. The same tasks day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. The work was not varied. It was not intellectually stimulating. It was simply work, to be done to the master's specifications, repeated until the movements became automatic and the apprentice could perform them without conscious thought. The master would occasionally provide instruction, explaining why something should be done in a particular way, demonstrating a technique, correcting the apprentice's mistakes. But much of the learning came simply from repetition. Do the same task 1,000 times and you will become proficient at it. Do it 10,000 times and you will become skilled. This was the medieval approach to education in the crafts, not formal instruction, but endless practice under supervision. After 7 years, if the apprentice had completed his term satisfactorily, he would become a journeyman. The word journeyman comes from the French journée, meaning day, indicating that a journeyman worked by the day for wages, unlike an apprentice who worked for room and board, or a master who worked for himself. The journeyman was now allowed to marry, to earn money, and to work for any master who would hire him. But he was not yet allowed to open his own shop or to train apprentices himself. Becoming a master required producing a masterpiece, a work that demonstrated the journeyman's skill to the satisfaction of the guild. This masterpiece was evaluated by guild officials who were themselves masters. They would examine it carefully, looking for flaws in workmanship, checking that all aspects met guild standards. If the masterpiece was judge satisfactory, and if the journeyman could pay the substantial fees required for admission to mastership, he would be admitted to the guild as a master craftsman. The guild regulations governed every aspect of how masters could conduct their business. When they could work, typically from sunrise to sunset, not before or after. Where they could work, usually in designated areas of the town with similar crafts grouped together. This is why many old European cities have streets named for the crafts that were once practiced there: Shoemaker Street, Baker Street, Weaver Lane. These names are fossil remnants of guild organisation. The guilds also regulated how many apprentices a master could take. This was typically limited to 1 or 2 at a time. The limit existed to ensure that each apprentice received adequate instruction and to prevent masters from accumulating excessive numbers of cheap labourers while claiming they were training them. The enforcement of this rule required monitoring by guild officials, who would periodically visit shops to count apprentices and ensure compliance. Quality standards were another major focus of guild regulation. A shoemaker's guild might specify exactly how many stitches per inch were required in certain types of shoes, what quality of leather could be used for which purposes, and how soles should be attached to uppers. These specifications were not written casually. They were debated in guild meetings that could last hours, with different masters advocating for different standards based on their own practices and opinions. The guild meetings themselves were exercises in democratic tedium. They were held regularly, typically monthly, in a guild hall or in a church. All masters were expected to attend. Absence without cause could result in a fine. The meetings would begin with reading the minutes of the previous meeting, a process that could take half an hour or more. Then old business would be addressed. Following up on decisions made previously, checking that fines had been paid, verifying that punishments had been carried out. New business would follow. This might include admission of new masters who would pay their fees and take oaths before the assembled guild. It might include presentation of complaints against members who had violated guild rules. It might include debates about proposed changes to regulations. These debates could become quite involved, with different masters speaking at length about why a proposed change was necessary or why it would be harmful. Medieval people were not naturally concise in their speaking, and guild meetings provided ample opportunity for long-winded orations. Voting on guild matters was done by show of hands or, for more serious matters, by secret ballot using beans or stones dropped into containers. The counting of votes was done publicly, with each vote tallied aloud by guild officers while everyone watched. This transparency was important in an era when corruption was common and trust was scarce, but it also made the voting process time-consuming, especially when the guild was large and many votes needed to be counted. The guilds also organised religious observations and social events. They would sponsor feast days, processions, and mystery plays. The mystery plays, which dramatise biblical stories, were particularly elaborate productions that required months of preparation. Each guild would be responsible for a particular scene or episode. The shoemakers might perform the story of Noah's Ark, while the shipwrights performed the voyage of the apostles. The productions were amateur, the acting was wooden, and the performances could stretch on for hours, but they served to build guild solidarity and to demonstrate the guild's importance to the wider community. The financial records of guilds, which sometimes survive in archives, provide insight into the tedious details of their operations. There would be entries for fees collected from new masters, fines collected from members who violated regulations, payments for candles used in the guild chapel, payments for repairs to the guild hall, payments for food and drink at guild feasts, payments to officials who supervised apprentices and maintained standards. Each entry would be recorded in careful handwriting, with the amount noted in Roman numerals or early Arabic numerals depending on the period. The accounts would be reviewed annually by auditors elected from among the guild members. These auditors would check each entry, verify that receipts matched expenditures, and report their findings to the full guild membership. The audit process could take days, as medieval bookkeeping was neither systematic nor standardized, and errors or discrepancies required investigation and resolution. The disciplinary procedures of guilds were formal and slow-moving. If a master was accused of producing substandard work or violating guild rules, a complaint would be filed with guild officers. These officers would investigate, which might involve visiting the master's shop, examining his work and interviewing witnesses. The investigation could take weeks or months. Eventually the matter would be brought before the guild for judgment. The accused would be given an opportunity to defend himself. Witnesses would testify. Guild members would deliberate and vote on the appropriate punishment. Punishments ranged from small fines for minor infractions to expulsion from the guild for serious violations. Expulsion was devastating because it meant the master could no longer legally practice his trade in that town. He would have to move elsewhere, find a new guild willing to admit him, and start over. The threat of expulsion was usually sufficient to ensure compliance with guild regulations, though some masters were stubborn or unscrupulous enough to require actual enforcement. Modern professional organisations, bar associations for lawyers, medical boards for doctors, licensing agencies for various trades, function in ways that would be recognisable to a medieval guildmaster. They require years of training, they administer examinations, they set standards for practice, they investigate complaints, and they have the power to revoke licenses. The forms have changed. We use written exams rather than requiring a physical masterpiece. We hold meetings in conference rooms rather than guild halls, but the basic structure of self-regulation by practitioners remains. Chapter 12. The specification of working hours. The regulation of working hours in medieval times established patterns that continue to influence modern labour law, particularly the concept that there should be standard times for work and rest. Medieval authorities, primarily guilds and town councils, established rules about when work could and could not be performed, creating the foundation for later labour regulations. Work was tied to daylight. This was not a regulation so much as a practical necessity. Artificial light was expensive, candles cost money, and oil lamps required oil that also cost money. So most work began at sunrise and ended at sunset. This meant that working hours varied with the seasons. In summer, the workday might be 15 or 16 hours long. In winter, it might be only 8 or 9 hours. Workers worked more total hours in a year than modern workers, but they worked fewer hours in winter, which provided a kind of seasonal balance. The beginning of the workday was often signalled by bells, church bells, which were used to mark the hours for religious services, also served as public timekeepers. When the bell rang for prime, the first service of the day, workers would begin their labour. When the bell rang for vespers, the evening service, work would cease. These bells were audible throughout a town or village, providing a synchronized signal that everyone could hear. The ringing of bells was itself a regulated activity. The bell ringer was often a paid position, held by someone responsible for maintaining accurate time and ringing bells at the correct moments. How did one maintain accurate time in an era before mechanical clocks were common? Various methods were used. Sundials worked during the day when the sun was visible. Water clocks, which measured time by the flow of water from one container to another, could work day and night. Hourglasses filled with sand served for shorter intervals. But all of these methods required attention and adjustment. The bell ringer's job involved constantly monitoring time and ensuring that bells rang when they were supposed to, a task that was both important and remarkably tedious. Meal breaks were also regulated. There would typically be a break at midday for dinner, which was the main meal of the day. This break might last an hour or two. Workers would eat, rest, and then return to their labour. Some guilds specified exactly how long breaks could be, preventing masters from working their employees or apprentices without adequate rest. Other guilds were less specific, leaving the matter to custom and the discretion of individual masters. Certain types of work were prohibited on Sundays and religious feast days. This was partly religious. Sunday was the Lord's Day, meant for worship and rest. but it was also economic. Guilds supported these prohibitions because they ensured that no one could gain an advantage by working more days than their competitors. If everyone was required to rest on Sunday, then the market remained level. Anyone who violated the prohibition would be subject to punishment by both religious and guild authorities. The number of religious feast days in the medieval calendar was substantial. In addition to every Sunday, there were feast days for major events in the Christian calendar: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and for numerous saints. Depending on the region and era, there might be 50 to 80 days per year when work was prohibited or restricted. This meant that the actual number of working days was considerably fewer than 365, even accounting for the longer summer work days. Some work was permitted on feast days despite general prohibitions. Necessary work, particularly anything related to food or public health, could usually be performed. Bakers could bake bread. Butchers could sell meat, at least in the morning. Innkeepers could serve travellers. But manufacturing and most retail commerce was supposed to cease. The enforcement of these rules varied. In some towns, authorities were strict, fining anyone caught working. In others, enforcement was lax, and many people worked regardless of the rules, especially if they were poor and needed the money. Night work was generally prohibited, particularly for manufacturing. This was partly because of the difficulty and expense of lighting, but also because night work could be used to conceal the production of substandard goods. If a shoemaker worked at night by candlelight, he might cut corners that would not be visible in dim light, but would become apparent in daylight. Guilds concerned with maintaining quality standards therefore prohibited most night work by their members. There were exceptions. Bakers often worked at night because bread needed to be ready for sale early in the morning. The process of making bread, mixing dough, letting it rise, kneading it again, shaping loaves, baking them, took many hours. To have bread ready at dawn, bakers needed to start work in the middle of the night. This was accepted because bread was essential, and because the guild could maintain quality standards through daylight inspections of the finished product. The regulation of working hours also extended to the pace of work. Some guilds prohibited hurrying or working too quickly, believing that haste led to poor quality. A carpenter was expected to work steadily and carefully, not to rush through tasks. This might seem counterintuitive from a modern perspective that values efficiency, but the medieval guild prioritized quality and consistency over speed. A piece of furniture that took 2 weeks to make and lasted 50 years was considered superior to one that took 1 week to make and lasted 20 years, even though the faster production was more efficient in the short term. The establishment of standard working hours had long-term implications. It created an expectation that work should be limited to certain times, that workers should have periods of rest, and that there should be communal days of non-work. These concepts, though they originated in a religious and guild context, eventually evolved into secular labour regulations. Modern laws about maximum working hours, mandatory rest breaks, overtime pay, and weekends all descend, in part from medieval regulations about when work could and could not be performed. Chapter 13. The Tedium of Tax Collection. Medieval tax collection was a process of such extraordinary complexity and inefficiency that it makes modern tax systems, for all their faults, seem almost elegant by comparison. The methods developed to assess and collect taxes established precedents that continue to influence how governments raise revenue today. There were many different types of taxes. Land taxes, based on the extent and productivity of land holdings. Head taxes, levied on each person. Sales taxes on certain goods. Customs duties on imports and exports. Special taxes levied for particular purposes like building fortifications or funding military campaigns. Each type of tax had its own method of assessment and collection, its own officials and its own complications. Land taxes required knowing who owned what land and how valuable that land was. This information was compiled in surveys, the most famous being the Domesday Book in England, completed in 1086. The Domesday Book recorded in remarkable detail the land holdings, resources and values of properties throughout most of England. It was created by sending commissioners to every county, where they summoned juries of local men and questioned them under oath about land ownership, population, livestock, mills, and anything else that might have value. The process of creating the Domesday Book took months. The commissioners would arrive in a county. They would organise meetings in various locations. Local men would be summoned to attend these meetings, leaving their farms and businesses to answer questions about their neighbours' property. The questioning was thorough and repetitive. How much land does this manor have? How many ploughs? How many villagers? How many slaves? What was the value 20 years ago? What is the value now? Question after question, manor after manor, day after day. The answers were recorded by scribes who travelled with the commissioners. These scribes wrote in Latin using abbreviations to save space on the expensive parchment. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read. Errors inevitably occurred. Names misspelled, numbers transposed, whole entries misplaced. But the survey continued, grinding forward with bureaucratic inevitability until the entire kingdom had been documented. Once completed, the Domesday Book provided a basis for taxation, but using it required interpretation. The values recorded were in pounds, shillings, and pence, but these were not necessarily actual amounts of money that anyone possessed. They were assessments of productive capacity, theoretical values that might or might not correspond to reality. Converting these values into actual tax obligations required calculations, adjustments for changes since the survey, and negotiations between taxpayers and tax collectors. The tax collectors themselves were often local men who contracted with the king or other authorities to collect taxes in a particular area. They would pay a lump sum up front for the right to collect taxes, then keep whatever they could collect beyond that amount. This system incentivized aggressive collection tactics, as the collector's profit depended on collecting more than he had paid for the privilege. The actual collection process involved visiting taxpayers, assessing what they owed based on records and surveys, and demanding payment. Taxpayers who could not or would not pay faced various penalties. Their property might be seized, they might be imprisoned, they might be subjected to additional fines. The threat of these penalties usually induced payment, though it might take multiple visits and much negotiation before money changed hands. Payment was not always in coin. Many people, especially peasants, had little money. They paid their taxes in kind, in grain, in livestock, in labour. A peasant might pay his land tax by delivering a certain amount of wheat to the lord's storehouse. He would harvest the wheat, thresh it to separate the grain from the chaff, load it onto a cart, transport it to the storehouse, and present it to the official who recorded such deliveries. The official would measure the grain, check its quality, and record the payment in his ledger. If the quality was poor or the amount insufficient, the peasant would be sent away to bring more or better grain. Taxes paid in labour were even more complex to administer. A peasant might owe several days of work on the lord's fields as part of his tax obligation. He would show up on the designated days and perform whatever work was required: ploughing, planting, harvesting. An official would supervise to ensure the work was actually performed. The days worked would be recorded, crossed off against the peasant's obligation, and the peasant would be released to return to his own fields. The record-keeping for all of this was extensive. Tax rolls listed every taxpayer, what they owed, what they had paid, and what remained due. These rolls were written on parchment in Latin or, later, in the vernacular. They were stored in chests in castles or administrative buildings. They were consulted whenever questions arose about whether someone had paid their taxes. They were updated periodically as taxes were paid or as new assessments were made. Disputes about taxes were common. A taxpayer might claim he did not owe as much as the collector demanded. The collector would point to the tax rolls and the original survey. The taxpayer would argue that circumstances had changed. His land had flooded. His livestock had died. He had already paid a different collector. These disputes would be taken to courts or to hearings before royal officials. Evidence would be presented, witnesses would testify. Eventually a decision would be reached, though it might take months or years, and by then the dispute might be moot or new disputes might have arisen. Special taxes levied for particular purposes required additional administration. If the king needed money for a military campaign, he might impose a tax on movable property, a percentage of the value of all goods that people owned. Assessing this tax required inventorying everyone's possessions. Commissioners would be appointed. They would visit households. They would list everything of value: furniture, tools, livestock, stored grain, cloth, dishes, everything. They would assign values to these items. They would calculate the tax owed. Then collectors would come to gather the tax, and the whole tedious process of collection would begin. The inefficiency of medieval tax collection was extraordinary. A significant portion of the taxes collected was consumed by the costs of collection itself. Commissioners needed to be paid. Scribes needed to be paid. Collectors needed to be paid or given their contracted percentage. Record keepers needed to be paid. Guards who enforced collection needed to be paid. By the time all these costs were subtracted, the net amount received by the royal treasury might be only half or 2/3 of what had been collected from taxpayers. Yet despite this inefficiency, the systems persisted. They persisted because they worked well enough to fund governments, armies, and public works. They persisted because developing better systems would have required investment and innovation that medieval authorities were rarely willing or able to make. And they persisted because they established principles that governments have the right to tax, that taxes should be based on some assessment of ability to pay, that records should be kept, that disputes should be adjudicated, that carried forward into modern tax systems. When you file your taxes today, you're participating in a system that has medieval roots. The idea that income should be reported, that records should be maintained, that assessments can be disputed, that there should be penalties for non-payment, all of these concepts have medieval precedents. The forms have changed. The calculations are more complex. The enforcement mechanisms are more sophisticated. But the basic framework of tax collection, established in medieval times through surveys, rolls, collectors, and courts, continues to structure how governments raise revenue. Chapter 14. The comprehensive regulation of trade and commerce. Trade in medieval times was not a free-for-all. It was regulated, constrained, monitored, and controlled through layers of rules that governed where trade could occur, when it could occur, what could be traded, how prices could be set, and what quality standards applied. These regulations established concepts that persist in modern commerce law, from fair trade practices to consumer protection. The most fundamental regulation was that most trade had to occur in designated marketplaces at designated times. This was not optional, it was law. If you wanted to sell wool, you had to bring it to the wool market on market day. If you wanted to buy cloth, you had to go to the cloth market when it was open. Private sales conducted outside of the official market structure were generally forbidden and could be punished if discovered. The reason for this regulation was control. If all trade occurred in specific places at specific times, authorities could monitor it, tax it, and enforce quality standards. If people could trade anywhere at any time, this oversight became impossible. So the market system was enforced, and people adapted to it, organizing their lives around the rhythm of market. Days and planning their purchases and sales to coincide with when markets were open. Markets opened early, typically at dawn, and closed in the afternoon, though the exact times varied by season and local custom. Opening and closing times might be signalled by bells or by officials who walked through the market announcing that it was time to begin or cease trading. Merchants who arrived too late might miss the best customers. Those who tried to continue trading after closing time would be fined. The physical layout of markets was also regulated. Different goods were sold in different areas. In a large market, there might be separate sections for livestock, grain, cloth, leather goods, metalwork, food, and so on. This organization served multiple purposes. It made it easier for customers to find what they wanted. It allowed authorities to assign different inspectors to different sections, and it prevented certain types of goods from contaminating others. You did not want fishmongers next to cloth sellers, for obvious aromatic reasons. Within each section, sellers would set up their stalls. A stall was typically a simple wooden frame with a board or table on which goods could be displayed. Some sellers had permanent stalls that remained in place from week to week. Others had to assemble and disassemble their stalls for each market day. The location of stalls was often regulated, with better locations going to guild members or to those who paid higher fees to market authorities. The goods themselves were subject to inspection. Market officials would circulate through the market examining merchandise. They would check weights and measures, ensuring that sellers were not cheating customers by using false scales or undersized vessels. They would inspect food for freshness, discarding anything that was spoiled or unsafe. They would examine manufactured goods for quality, checking that they met guild standards or local regulations. This inspection process was constant and thorough. An official might spend his entire market day walking from stall to stall, checking goods, weighing portions, questioning sellers, and recording violations. If he found a problem, short wait, spoiled food, substandard craftsmanship, he would confiscate the offending goods and fine the seller. The confiscated goods might be destroyed publicly as a warning to others, or they might be given to the poor if they were still usable. Price regulation was another major concern. Medieval authorities held that there was a just price for goods, a fair price that reflected the actual value of the item and the labour that went into producing it, without excessive profit. Determining what constituted a just price was complex and often contentious. Generally, it was expected that prices should be stable and predictable, not fluctuating wildly based on supply and demand or on the seller's assessment of what the market would bear. When prices did rise, authorities investigated to determine whether the increase was justified. If a drought had reduced the grain harvest, higher bread prices might be accepted as reflecting genuine scarcity. But if prices rose because merchants were hoarding goods to create artificial shortages, this was considered a serious offence called engrossing or forestalling, and it was punished severely. Forestalling specifically referred to buying up goods before they reached the market, intending to resell them at higher prices. This practice was forbidden because it interfered with the proper functioning of the market system. Grain merchants were particular targets of anti-forestalling regulations. A merchant who met farmers on the road to town and bought their grain before it reached the market, or who bought the entire harvest from a farm before it was even planted, could be prosecuted. The penalties included fines, confiscation of goods, and sometimes imprisonment or the pillory. Engrossing referred to buying up large quantities of a good to corner the market and drive up prices. A merchant who bought all the wool or all the fish at a market, intending to resell it piecemeal at inflated prices, was engaging in engrossing. This too was illegal and punished. The difficulty was proving intent. A merchant might claim he needed large quantities for legitimate purposes. Perhaps he had customers in another town who had ordered those goods. Distinguishing between legitimate bulk buying and market manipulation required investigation and judgment. Regrating was buying goods retail and reselling them at a higher price in the same market or a nearby market. This was forbidden because it was seen as parasitic. The regrater added no value, merely inserting himself as a middleman to extract profit. There were some exceptions for goods that required processing or transportation, but generally, regrating was prohibited. The enforcement of these regulations required a bureaucracy of market officials, inspectors, and courts. Each market would have officials appointed by the town or by the lord who had granted the market charter. These officials would monitor trading, resolve disputes, and prosecute violations. They would keep records of fines collected and goods confiscated. They would report to higher authorities about the functioning of the market. International trade added additional layers of regulation. Goods crossing borders were subject to customs duties, taxes on imports and exports. Collecting these duties required officials stationed at ports and border crossings. These officials would examine incoming and outgoing goods, assess their value, calculate the duty owed, and collect payment. The assessment of value was often contentious, as merchants naturally wanted to claim their goods were worth less to reduce their tax burden, while customs officials wanted to assess higher values to collect more revenue. The goods themselves had to be examined to determine what they were and to verify they matched what the merchant claimed. A merchant might declare he was importing common wool, which had a low duty, when in fact he was importing fine wool, which had a higher duty. Customs officials would inspect the wool, judge its quality, and assess the appropriate duty. This required expertise, as different qualities of wool looked similar to untrained eyes. Officials learned to distinguish fine from coarse by touch, sight, and sometimes even smell. Smuggling was a constant problem. Merchants would attempt to avoid customs duties by hiding goods, by misrepresenting what they were carrying, by bribing officials, or by crossing at unmonitored locations. Authorities responded by increasing patrols, imposing harsh penalties for smuggling, and requiring that trade only occur through official ports and crossings. Smuggled goods, if discovered, would be confiscated. The smuggler would be heavily fined and might face imprisonment. But the potential profits from avoiding duties were substantial, so smuggling continued despite the risks. Foreign merchants trading in a country were subject to special regulations. They might be required to use local agents or hosts who would facilitate their transactions and ensured they followed local rules. They might be restricted in where they could trade and for how long they could stay. They might be required to sell their goods wholesale to local merchants, rather than selling directly to consumers. These restrictions served to protect local merchants from foreign competition and to ensure that foreign traders could be monitored and taxed effectively. The Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant guilds and trading cities in northern Europe, developed its own extensive system of trade regulations. League members followed common commercial practices, used standardized contracts, and maintained trading posts in foreign cities where League merchants could conduct business according to League rules. The League negotiated trade agreements with kingdoms and cities, securing favourable terms for its members. It also enforced internal discipline, expelling members who violated League rules, and sometimes even using military force to protect League interests. Within the League system, trade was highly organised. Merchants would travel in convoys for safety. They would stay in League-operated facilities when in foreign ports. They would follow League protocols for conducting business. Records were kept of all major transactions. Disputes were resolved through League arbitration rather than local courts. This created a parallel commercial legal system that operated across national boundaries, facilitating long-distance trade despite the political fragmentation of medieval Europe. The documentation of trade was extensive. Bills of sale recorded the transfer of goods from seller to buyer. These documents specified what was sold, the quantity, the price, the date, and the parties involved. They might also include conditions of sale, when payment was due, what recourse the buyer had if the goods proved defective, and so on. These bills were written on parchment or paper, sealed with wax seals to authenticate them, and stored by the parties in case disputes later arose. Contracts for future delivery of goods were also common. A merchant might contract with a wool producer to deliver a certain quantity of wool at the next shearing season. The contract would specify the quantity, quality, price, and delivery terms. Both parties would sign or seal the contract. If either party failed to fulfill their obligations, the other could seek remedy through the courts, presenting the contract as evidence. Letters of credit facilitated long-distance trade without requiring merchants to carry large amounts of coin. A merchant in London wanting to buy goods in Venice could obtain a letter of credit from a banker. The letter would authorize the merchant to draw a certain amount of credit in Venice. The Venetian banker who honoured the letter would later collect from the London banker, typically taking a percentage as a fee for the service. This system required networks of bankers who trusted each other and careful record-keeping to track obligations. The accounting systems developed to manage trade were surprisingly sophisticated. Double-entry bookkeeping, which records each transaction twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, emerged in medieval Italy. This method made it easier to detect errors and to see the overall financial position of a business. Merchants who adopted double-entry bookkeeping maintained detailed ledgers recording all their transactions. These ledgers were written in beautiful, clear handwriting, with columns of numbers, dates, and descriptions filling page after page. The actual practice of medieval accounting was tedious. Each transaction had to be recorded by hand. Arithmetic had to be done without calculators, using mental math, or counting boards with counters. Errors were common and had to be found and corrected. At the end of each accounting period, typically a year, the accounts would be closed, totals calculated, and a new ledger started. This process could take days or weeks, depending on the volume of transactions. Trade fairs provided opportunities for settling accounts between merchants. At major fairs like those at Champagne in France, merchants would arrive with lists of who owed them money and whom they owed. These debts would be offset against each other. If merchant A owed merchant B £100 and merchant B owed merchant A £80, the debts would be netted and merchant A would pay merchant B £20. These netting reduced the amount of actual money that needed to change hands, which was important because moving large amounts of coin was risky and expensive. The fair would maintain clearinghouses where these settlements occurred. Merchants would present their records. Officials would verify the claims. Calculations would be made. Adjustments would be negotiated when there were disputes. The process could take days, with merchants sitting at tables going through piles of documents, comparing records, and working out what was owed. It was meticulous, exhausting work, but it was necessary for the functioning of long-distance trade. Modern commercial law, with its contracts, its documentation, its standards for trade practices, its consumer protections, and its mechanisms for dispute resolution, all descends from medieval trade regulations. When you sign a purchase agreement for a car or a house, you are using a document format that has medieval origins. When a regulatory agency inspects food for safety or weighs packaged goods to verify they contain the amount claimed, it is performing functions that medieval market officials performed. When international trade agreements specify tariffs, quotas, and standards, they are continuing traditions of trade, regulation that date back centuries. The complexity of medieval trade regulation reflected the challenges of commerce. in an era without modern communications, transportation, or financial systems. Everything that is now handled electronically had to be done on parchment or paper, by hand, with seal and signature. Everything that now happens instantly took days or weeks, yet the basic functions, documenting transactions, ensuring quality, preventing fraud, facilitating payment, resolving disputes, remain the same. Medieval merchants and modern businesses face many of the same challenges, just with vastly different tools for addressing them. Chapter 15. The laborious process of medieval justice. The medieval legal system was a complex web of overlapping jurisdictions, each with its own courts, procedures, and traditions. Understanding this system induces a particular kind of mental fatigue that is ideal for falling asleep. Yet elements of medieval legal procedure, the right to a jury, the presentation of the evidence, the examination of witnesses, persist in modern courtrooms. There were many different types of courts in medieval society. Manorial courts handled disputes between tenants and enforced local regulations. Borough courts dealt with urban matters. Royal courts handled serious crimes and disputes involving the king's interests. Church courts had jurisdiction over religious matters and anything involving clergy. Merchant courts resolved commercial disputes. Each court had its own procedures, though they shared common elements. A case would typically begin with a complaint or accusation. Someone would come forward claiming they had been wronged, robbed, assaulted, defrauded, slandered. They would present their complaint to the appropriate court. This required knowing which court had jurisdiction, which was not always obvious. If you were wronged by a clergyman, should you go to the church court or the secular court if you had a dispute with a merchant from another town? Which town's court should hear the case? These jurisdictional questions could themselves become subjects of lengthy disputes. Once a complaint was lodged, the accused would be summoned to appear in court. The summons was delivered by a court official who would travel to wherever the accused lived or worked and inform them of the accusation and the date they needed to appear. If the accused could not be found, the summons might be read publicly in the market square, on the theory that someone would hear it and inform the accused. The court would meet on the appointed day. All the participants would gather, the judge or judges, the plaintiff, the defendant, any witnesses, and often a crowd of onlookers, as court proceedings were public entertainment in an era with limited entertainment options. The proceedings would begin with formalities, oaths, prayers, and the reading of relevant laws or customs. The plaintiff would present their case first. They would describe what happened, providing details of the wrong they suffered. This presentation was often done orally, with the plaintiff speaking directly to the judge. If the plaintiff was illiterate or inarticulate, they might hire someone to speak for them, a kind of early lawyer who would present the case in proper legal language. After the plaintiff spoke, the defendant would respond. They might deny the accusation entirely, or they might admit the facts but argue they were justified, or they might offer excuses or explanations. This response, like the initial complaint, was typically oral. The defendant spoke for themselves or through a representative. Then came the presentation of evidence. In modern courts, evidence might include documents, physical objects, expert testimony, and so on. Medieval courts had all of these things, but they were less systematized. Documents were rare and treated with suspicion, as forgery was common. Physical objects might be presented. A weapon, allegedly used in a crime, goods allegedly stolen, but their significance had to be established through testimony. Witnesses were their primary form of evidence. People who had seen or heard relevant events would be called to testify. They would swear an oath to tell the truth, usually on a Bible or some other holy object. Then they would describe what they knew. The testimony was not structured with questions and answers as in modern courts. Instead, witnesses simply narrated what they had observed or experienced, with occasional interruptions from the judge or parties asking for clarification. The quality of testimony varied enormously. Some witnesses were clear and credible. Others were confused, forgetful, or deliberately evasive. The judge had to assess credibility, which was done through intuition and experience rather than any systematic method. A witness who stammered or couldn't look the judge in the eye might be considered less trustworthy than one who spoke clearly and confidently, even though these behavioral cues are unreliable indicators of honesty. Character witnesses were also common. People would testify not about specific events, but about the general character of the plaintiff or defendant. I have known the accused for 20 years, and he is an honest man who would never steal. Or, the plaintiff is known throughout the village as a troublemaker and a liar. These character assessments were considered relevant to judging the truth of accusations. In some cases, the number of witnesses mattered more than what they said. A practice called compurgation allowed a defendant to bring oath helpers, people who would swear that the defendant's oath of innocence was trustworthy. If the defendant could bring a sufficient number of oath helpers, often 12, they would win the case regardless of any evidence against them. This system seems bizarre from a modern perspective, but it made sense in a society where community reputation and social bonds were paramount. If 12 respectable community members were willing to vouch for someone, that person probably was telling the truth, or at least the community wanted to believe they were. When evidence was ambiguous, or when both sides seemed equally credible, courts might resort to trial by ordeal. The accused would undergo a painful or dangerous test, and the outcome would be interpreted as God's judgment on their guilt or innocence. There were various forms of ordeal. In trial by hot iron, the accused would carry a hot iron bar for a certain distance. Their hand would then be bandaged. After 3 days, the bandage would be removed. If the burn was healing cleanly, they were innocent. If it was festering, they were guilty. Trial by water involved binding the accused and throwing them into a body of water. If they floated, they were guilty. The pure water rejected them. If they sank, they were innocent. The water accepted them, though they would then need to be pulled out quickly before they drowned. The logic of these ordeals seems laughable now, but they were taken seriously in their time. The psychological pressure of undergoing an ordeal may have induced confessions from guilty parties, making the procedure effective even though its theological basis was questionable. Trial by combat was another option, primarily in cases involving noblemen or serious accusations. The accuser and accused would fight, either personally or through champions who fought on their behalf. The winner of the combat won the case, on the theory that God would grant victory to the party in the right. Combat trials were exhausting affairs. They might last hours, with armoured men swinging weapons at each other until one was disabled, killed, or surrendered. They were also expensive, as armour, weapons, and trained champions all cost money, limiting this option to the wealthy. After all evidence was presented and any ordeals or combats completed, the judge or jury in some courts would render a judgment. This might happen immediately, or there might be a delay for deliberation. The judgment would be announced publicly. If the defendant was found guilty, the sentence would be pronounced. Sentences varied with the severity of the crime and the status of the offender. For theft, the punishment might be a fine, return of the stolen goods with added penalties, time in the stocks or pillory, whipping, or, for repeat offenders, hanging or mutilation. For assault, fines were common, with the amount varying based on the severity of injury. For murder, the penalty was death, usually by hanging, though noblemen might be beheaded instead, which was considered a more honourable death. Not all sentences were carried out as pronounced. Condemned criminals might seek pardon from the king or other high authorities. These pardons were sometimes granted, especially if the criminal had powerful friends or if mitigating circumstances could be argued. The process of seeking a pardon involved petitions, fees, and often considerable delay, during which the condemned person would remain imprisoned, uncertain of their fate. Imprisonment itself was not usually a punishment in medieval times. Prisons were holding facilities where accused persons waited for trial, or where condemned persons waited for their sentences to be carried out. The idea of imprisonment as punishment, serving a sentence of years in prison, is largely a modern innovation. Medieval punishments were immediate: fines, physical punishment, banishment, or death. This made punishment a spectacle, a public event that reinforced social norms and deterred others from similar crimes. Appeals were possible but complicated. An appeal might go to a higher court, from a manorial court to a royal court, for example. The process required filing formal documents, paying fees, and waiting for the higher court to schedule a hearing. This could take months or years. During this time, the original judgment might or might not be suspended depending on the circumstances. The costs of medieval justice were substantial. Court fees had to be paid. Witnesses might need to be compensated for their time. Lawyers or representatives had to be hired. Documents had to be drawn up and sealed. If the case dragged on for months or years, these costs accumulated, potentially bankrupting the parties involved. Poor people often could not afford to pursue their legal rights, even when they had valid claims. Record-keeping was essential to medieval justice. Court clerks recorded proceedings, judgments, and sentences in rolls, long sheets of parchment that were sewn together and rolled up for storage. These rolls recorded not just the outcomes, but often the arguments and evidence presented. Reading medieval court rolls today provides insight into the disputes and crimes of the era, though the dense legal language and faded ink make this a challenging task. The courts also generated financial records, fees collected, fines imposed, costs awarded. These records were maintained separately and audited periodically. Accounting for court revenues was important because courts were profit centres for those who operated them. Fines collected went to the king or the lord who held jurisdiction. This created a financial incentive to find people guilty and impose fines, though this incentive was balanced somewhat by the risk that excessive harshness would provoke resistance or appeals. Modern legal systems have evolved considerably from medieval practices. We no longer use ordeals or trial by combat. We have professional judges and lawyers rather than relying on local notables and self-representation. We have systematic rules of evidence and procedure. We have appeals courts and structured appellate review. We imprison people as punishment rather than merely holding them for trial. Yet many fundamental elements remain. The right to face your accuser, the presentation of evidence, the examination of witnesses, the rendering of judgment by a neutral authority, the possibility of appeal. These are all medieval concepts that have been refined and elaborated but not fundamentally changed. When you serve on a jury, when you testify as a witness, when you see a defendant being questioned by a judge, you are participating in processes that have medieval roots, processes that have been repeated millions of times over hundreds of years, wearing grooves of procedure and custom that guide how justice is administered today. Conclusion: the persistence of the past. And so we reach the end of our journey through the remarkably boring regulations and customs of medieval times that continue to influence our modern world. From barleycorns to boundary walks, from bread weights to beer tasting, from primogeniture to property disputes, the medieval world established patterns that proved surprisingly durable. These patterns persist not because they are optimal. Many of them are, by modern standards, inefficient, illogical, or outdated. They persist because changing them would require effort, coordination, and agreement among many parties. They persist because they are embedded in laws, in customs, in the physical infrastructure of measurements and boundaries. They persist because, quite simply, they are there, and removing them would be more work than leaving them in place. The medieval mind did not value efficiency in the way we do. Medieval people had time. They lived in a world where most activities unfolded slowly. Travelling took days or weeks. Building projects took years or decades. Legal cases dragged on for generations. In such a world, spending an hour negotiating the price of wool or an afternoon walking property boundaries did not seem like wasted time. It was simply how things were done. Our modern world, with its emphasis on speed and efficiency, finds these medieval practices puzzling. Why measure things in barleycorns when we could use centimetres? Why keep property in acres when hectares are more logical? Why maintain complex inheritance laws when simpler rules would work as well? These are reasonable questions, but they miss the point. We maintain these practices not because they are best, but because they are traditional, and tradition has its own inertia. Perhaps centuries from now, people will look back at our current practices with similar puzzlement. Why did they measure computer storage in binary rather than decimal units? Why did they regulate businesses through thousands of pages of incomprehensible code? Why did they maintain different voltage standards in different countries? These future observers will likely conclude that we, like our medieval ancestors, did things in particular ways not because those ways were optimal, but because they were established, familiar, and easier to maintain than to change. And so the patterns continue, the measurements persist, the customs endure, the regulations remain, in effect modified and updated perhaps, but recognizably descended from decisions made centuries ago by people whose primary concern was not innovation, but stability, not efficiency but familiarity, not progress but continuity. The medieval world is not as distant as we sometimes imagine. It is there in the inches we measure, the days we shop, the property we own, and the laws we follow. It is present in the background of our daily lives, unremarked and mostly unnoticed, a layer of historical sediment beneath the modern surface. And perhaps that is fitting. The medieval world was not dramatic or exciting for the vast majority of people who lived in it. It was routine, predictable, and profoundly ordinary. That these ordinary practices have persisted into our own time is, in its way, the most ordinary thing of all. Now, as you drift towards sleep, you might reflect on these connections to the past. Tomorrow, when you buy bread that is weighed to verify its labelled weight, you are participating in a system that dates back to 1266. When you measure something in inches, you are using a unit defined by barley corns. When you attend a farmer's market on its traditional day, you are following a pattern established by medieval market charters. These thoughts are neither exciting nor disturbing. They are simply facts, as unremarkable as the medieval world itself, which unfolded day by day, decade by decade, century by century, in a slow accumulation of ordinary moments and mundane regulations that somehow, inexplicably, shaped the world we inhabit today. Sleep well.